Hello, and welcome to another prize-winning podcast episode. No, they just can't help themselves. Let's head over to Studio 2B.
Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
So just to start off with, I just wish everybody a happy Black Country Day. So that's just a local celebration for where I am. You have to Google it for people who've never heard of the Black Country, which is a region in the West Midlands of England. But anyway, today we've got another episode with a very special guest. And we don't often have people who are really top of their field. And my understanding is that this particular guest is definitely an authority. I mean, she may be a bit more authoritative in terms of where she stands in this particular field. But I'd like to introduce our guest, which is Professor Patricia Limerick. Hello, Patty.
Hello, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
And then it's usually Ian, and I have to jump in and say, okay, over to you.
Well, today what we're going to do, hopefully, is tap into Patty's expertise. And we're going to talk about, and keep me straight here, Patty, the Old West, or the myth of the Old West, how the Old West was portrayed, has been portrayed, how accurate it was. And so let's see how the conversation goes. But around that sort of traditional, what I would call from my childhood, cowboys and Indians, cowboys and cavalry and Indians, all of the above plus everything else. Native Americans, obviously, as we'd call them nowadays, but let's stick to the...
But just as a quick preamble, just so that you know, Patty, this all came about because I was on holiday with my family. My daughter lives in the US, and we went to this theme park called Wild West City somewhere in Pennsylvania. Can't remember where, or in New York. Can't remember which state it was. It was around there anyway. Might have been New Jersey now, on the way back. Anyway, and they had a main street where they had all of the gunfights and all of this type of stuff. And round the back, they had some huts, like wooden huts, log cabins, that type of stuff. And my granddaughter was getting a bit fed up of the guns going off. There was a loud noise. I mean, she was only 2 at the time. So we walked round and I think, oh, what's this? It was, so the first log cabin we came to was some guy dressed up as a trapper. And after 20 minutes, it felt like we were trapped because it felt like he never spoke to anybody. Nobody ever went round the back, and they were they were really informative, really friendly. And there was the trapper, and there was a post office, and there was a school mom, and she was telling me some things about the films don't show this and the films don't show that, and I was thinking that's really interesting. That so ultimately, I'd asked my friend Claude, the AI, who would be the top guest to talk about this, and that's where your name came out top, right at the very top, as the main person who would be really informative on this. I mean, ultimately, that's where this came from, and Ian was really into it as well. It's almost like we've got our own backgrounds and thoughts and what we've seen in the films, but what I understand the reality is quite a lot different.
Yeah.
Right. So, do you want to give us a bit of background as to, how you got into history, why this particular subject?
Absolutely. So, I was addict isn't quite the right word, but an over-the-top enthusiast for storytelling from childhood. I had parents who, if they were mad at you and you had done something really quite reprehensible, if you could distract them with the story, you would get off the hook. So that probably was the bedrock of I think whatever I do, I want to be able to use stories to save me from difficult situations and awkward moments. So literature, maybe that might have worked. I took various courses and lots of different things, but history was where I thought, I am so much more taken with stories that did not come from the mind of an author. There was something about exploring around in Nathaniel Hawthorne's mind, or Charles Dickens's mind for that matter. And I just thought, I don't think I want to be around in this guy's mind all the time. So history, nonfiction stories were just much more engaging for that whole, what's going on here? What does it mean? How do we figure it out? I decided I would much rather do that with history than with reading novels and fiction. So then for the West, I had grown up in Southern California, Western American history was not really well recognized in my hometown. We had a Banning, California is in the San Gorgonio Pass, and it was for a while it had a railroad coming through it, which is why we got the name Banning. The fellow who was the person who got off the train there once, he was worked for the big railroad companies, and he got off the train and said he would make a big investment in this town, and so that's why it was named Banning. This guy's pretty interesting because he ended up being asked by a really big railroad guy to bribe. He was supposed to bribe the territorial legislature in Arizona to give them the best possible location and route. And so he got a lot of money to go bribe the Arizona legislators. And then it was a little bit awkward. He had to return a good share of the money because the legislature in Arizona, the territorial legislature, turned out to be cheaper than anybody had expected. So he returned. So I think that's a pretty interesting story about today. We are concerned about corruption, and we should be, but this whole interesting Western history thing where it was just totally common practice to bribe legislators to get what you wanted, to bribe legislators to elect you to the Senate and so on. So I liked stories, and that just seemed worth following up on. I will say that the stories of the American West, I guess because of the things that you guys are interested in, the whole Hollywood thing, did not seem as intense and meaningful and multi-layered as they actually are. So, and I should tell you, my father worked for Republic Films for a while and wrote very lame scripts for beat films. So my father had a very negative attitude towards Hollywood. And so for various reasons, I just thought, I don't think we want to do the West. So I went to college, and I did not have any, there were no Western historians there. And then I went to graduate school on the East Coast, and somehow or other, this is not uncommon. People from the West going to the East Coast to study and looking back at their home territory think, that's actually a pretty interesting place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. And I also was sad to see how fields like British colonial history for the Atlantic coast, history of the South, history of slavery, and so on, those things were much more written by historians who really had to be taken seriously, who were raising questions that anyone in any field would have to take seriously. So I decided, and there was an era there where I think we would have thought that back in those days, that the scarlet letter, the A, would not have been for adultery, but for ambition. So kind of hippie years. So you weren't supposed to be ambitious, but I was like, well, this looks like an opportunity. There are just not that many extremely thought-provoking books written about the West. Maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe we could try to get this field up to the standing of the writing on Southern history, history of slavery, and so on. So I think I got a real unit of ambition. And I also looked back at my home area and thought, well, this deserves more attention and more thought and more reflection and just more taken seriously. As I wrote in the book, Legacy of Conquest, when that came out in 1987, it said that children, lots of places, played cowboys and Indians, but they did not play slaves and masters. And parents would have been troubled if they had done that. Parents would have said, oh, we need to intervene here. So I really loved the opportunity which came upon me when I was leaving graduate school, starting a job leaving graduate school at Yale and starting a job at Harvard, and thinking, this is kind of an opportunity. The person who had in many ways set the framework for Western American history, Frederick Jackson Turner, had taught at Harvard. His protege, Frederick Merck, had taught there for years. And then there had been a more than 2-decade gap with no one teaching Western history. So that kind of went to my head. I thought, well, this is a pretty good positioning here. So result of that, various exercises I got to take part in over the next year or two of watching what was going on in the West. I thought, time's here, because people were thinking, it was an era, the late 70s, early 80s, big era of energy boom towns. People were expressing concern about energy boom towns in the West, treating that as if that were a whole new problem, whole new challenge that had come over them. And I was thinking, you guys don't know that boom towns in the West, that's the longest running story. Well, so it became clear to me that someone needed to write a book that would connect the Western past to the Western present. And that sounds like a fairly obvious, simple thing to do. But for me, it was just wonderful to think, well, nobody else seems to be doing that. So that's what I got to do as quite a young scholar, was write this book, The Legacy of Conquest, The Unbroken Past of the American West. And that came out in 1987. And to this day, good heavens, Graduate students have to read it. If you go online and you look at the sample test essay question for the graduate record exam in history, you find a question about comparing the work of Frederick Jackson Turner to the work of Patricia Limerick, which is a little bit like ending up in a museum in a diorama. It's sort of like, here I am. Now I'm an artifact of ancient relic. So I've been very happy about having the chance to really have the right timing to come out and write a book that someone else was probably going to write, but I got to be the one to say there are all these studies of Western American history, and they are not brought together in a clear statement of what has to change in the old model. The old model had been so focused on the westward movement of white folks and really such a diminished round of attention to Native American people or to Mexican people or to French Canadian people. I mean, just a very focused on English-speaking white folks. So lucky me, that came out in 1987. It still is considered to be a book that changed the field. Of course, I only changed it because so many other people had written articles and books that I was able to read and bring together. So it is kind of my achievement, but it's also a clever exercise in creating a bibliography and footnotes, which seems very dull, but it's not dull, because then when you get to do that, you get to put together ideas that had not been brought together and stories that had not been brought together. So that was way too long. Sorry to do that to you, but that's my...
Don't worry, we love this. I know you can't see us, Patty, but we're nodding along and smiling and...
Oh, no, I cannot see you. I really cannot see you. So that's a little bit of my... Alrighty.
Right. And after a quick technical break, we're back in the room with Patty. So you went to Harvard.
And
we would, strangely enough, Ian and myself were just talking about how, and that you hit a key thing in terms of American history, certainly from our perspective, in that we know a lot about the eastern side of the US and its history, in those 13 states and all that type of stuff. I mean, particularly because of the 250th anniversary. But if you then start saying, well, what do you know about the western side of the US? It's based on cowboy films, arguably. Yeah, and that's not history.
Right. And that was, by the way, I have misspelled my own name and typing my name here. Ignore that. Why don't you ignore that? And you just use your last initial, so I should have just been Patty L. Oh, okay. So for me, that was very much my motivation, was that what was called American history was really Eastern United States history. And that was, as a person from far west, I just thought, well, that's not fair. It's regional history that they're doing, but they don't seem to notice that. So that was a big motivator for me. If you looked at, I actually ended up being assigned to read, that was a slog, read American history textbooks in the early 1990s. I looked at a whole slew of American history textbooks to see how they treated the West. And how they treated the West, it actually didn't take that much time, because it would say West, sea frontier. I think, well, that's a little bit exclusive. Why are we doing that? So the pattern was very much to have a chapter that had a fair amount of what was called manifest destiny, westward expansion in the 1830s and 1840s. And then in some way, the West got a little bit, no, it didn't really, but got some attention, not as much as it should have, as the provocation for the Civil War. It was not slavery in the South that started the Civil War. It was slavery as it might expand into the West. Anyway, then it was back to the Eastern United States as soon as that little episode was over. So that seemed like such a weird choice of place exclusion. And so that was a huge part of my campaign, was to say, that's not American history. Don't call that American history if it's not the history of the whole continent. So I feel like that actually had a lasting impact. I remember going to conferences of mainstream American historians at that time, and they were kind of crabby because I had pointed out to them that there were some failures and lacking. I don't really know how much better it is, but I do know that the Western History Association had shrunk in attendance, maybe 200 people, mostly older people. The pattern was very much that when a Western historian retired, a department would say, oh, thank heavens, we can get somebody in an important field. So, although
in the mid-90s, I'm just thinking, and I'm sure you're aware of the historical writer Stephen Ambrose, who is obviously semi-controversial in some regards in terms of some of his World War II stuff. So this is Band of Brothers, John, for example. And he wrote at least two books that he wrote a book about Sitting Bull. I'm sure he did. It was either Sitting Bull or Geronimo, and I can't remember which now. And he did write a book about the Transcontinental Railway that I also read. So I guess, and he was very popular. I mean, he's been dead 7 or 8 years now, at least. And whether he was writing those on the back of Band of Brothers or whatever, I can't actually recall. But I suppose he stuck his toe in the water of attempting to do stuff, and he must have been well read. Well, what I mean by that is he must have been read quite well. His books must have sold quite well at the time.
Right.
Was that an attempt to? Was he? Did you know why he did that? Were you aware of him doing that at the time, or?
Bill, this is a big problem that you can barely mention a name without my having a quite elaborate story of my encounter with. So,
well, no, I'd love to hear an account.
This is what I like. Yeah.
If you want to try another name, I will not fault you for that. So, okay. So he wrote a book called Undaunted Courage about Meriwether Lewis.
Yes,
on the Transcontinental Railroad,
yes.
quite right?
Yeah.
Even that, the Transcontinental Road book, I think was called Nothing Like It in the World, which was a silly title because empires were building railroads everywhere.
Yeah.
In the world. So to say nothing like it in the world was, that's not quite right. So anyway, so I took part in Ken Burns's series on the West. I'm and in some of that. Then some years passed, not very many, and then Ken Burns did a documentary on Meriwether Lewis, three part, and Stephen Ambrose was the lead figure in that talking head. So I reviewed that in the New York Times, the arts and culture section. I did not think it was a particularly well done film, so everyone was mad at me for one. But to Stephen Ambrose's credit, he wrote me and told me that this had been very hard on him because he had quite a number of children, and several of them had gone into fields of history, and they were fans of mine. So this had been bad for them to write critically of their father. And he also said, beautiful. Maureen Dowd is a New York Times columnist who writes very scorchingly about politicians. He said that every public figure in Washington wakes up every morning and hopes that Maureen Dowd won't write about him. And every Western historian wakes up in the morning hoping that Pattie Limerick won't write about him. So that was so flattering. That was such a nice thing to say. So that got us into quite a long correspondence and actually got us to have a public event together in Denver. So it starts off the correspondence is really funny. It's really interesting. And we go back and forth quite a bit about our stances on Western history. But what we finally reached, oh my goodness, we reached the thing. Boy, speaking of his thoughts about war and his writing about war. Okay, so you may know that Meriwether Lewis, the one genuine misfortune, really big misfortune of the Lewis and Clark expedition was that there was a hunting group that went out, and one of the French Canadians thought he was firing at a deer, but it was Meriwether Lewis. So he hit Meriwether Lewis in the rear end. And so Lewis had to take much of the trip just lying face down in the canoes. So I told that story, and the New York Times had a big problem about how I could refer to a person's rear end. We had a long exchange about that, and
those change days these days. I suspect, aren't they? Yeah.
We got derriere. So I told that story that was not in the film. The film was so focused on heroism that it was not going to tell a story. So that then caused Stephen Ambrose to finally say that I had characterized that as fragging when an enlisted guy kills an officer. Yeah.
But yes, when they throw a grenade in their tent or whatever, yes, call it fragging, don't they? Yeah.
I certainly hadn't said that, and I didn't think it was that. I thought the Canadian heard a rustling in the brush and thought, oh, there's a good chance, and probably, good Lord, Lewis was wearing buckskin, so there's one of them. So anyway, so that got us into quite an elaborate conversation.
So just to go back, was he affronted? Was Stephen Ambrose affronted that somebody in his party could possibly even? I mean, why? As a historian, why would he? Surely he's after the truth, and you hadn't said that anyway. But even if he had some evidence that had happened, why would he, as this historian, be affronted on people who've been dead 150 years?
Oh, I mean, on their behalf. Well, this was a friend on their behalf. It was a an affront on his authority and his
okay.
reputation. So, and my people are not immune from a lot of strong feelings about that.
Yeah.
And I actually, because I was attacked in such weird ways, when Legacy of Conquest came out, a lot of older guys really went at it tooth and nail. And one guy wrote a piece calling me a Stalinist, a deconstructionist, and a fascist. I think I was all of those things. So I don't know, it wasn't really much of that. So that was a very strange overreaction. And the result of that, I was critiqued for, one person said that Pattie Limerick does not have a single nice thing to say about a white man. So I had to point out in some places, well, it was dedicated to my white husband and my white nephew. Okay. So anyway, so that was such an overreaction that I became unusual in the profession of history, that I love it when someone criticizes something I said that I actually said. I'm just like, oh, this is great. Now we have a conversation. This is really good. Because I did say that, and I probably should have thought more about that, or I missed this, or I overlooked that, or so I'm really in a state of, I'll say, joy when someone has actually said, Limerick got this wrong, and then actually refers to something I said. Oh boy, now the profession is really thriving. So a lot of the time we don't really get to do that. And now I'm so happy that I really wanted to, I didn't like the fact that people were telling me that Western American history was a tired field. That was the first thing I was asked at my job interviews was, why would you go into this backwater of a field? This is in the late 70s.
Yeah.
I love the fact that it's so, I just kept saying when Legacy came out, I kept saying we're on the edge of a renaissance in Western American history. And I thought, I certainly hope that's true, or I'm going to look really silly for having said that.
Why do you think it was why was it overlooked in university stroke historical opinion, but became such a massive cultural pop phenomenon?
Yeah, that's right.
Because there's thousands of Western films, and there's probably a dozen colonial films, if that, certainly that are shown.
Really great point. Well, okay, so the reality, that's a funny word to use here, what I'm about to say, the reality of the history of the American West is that it was romanticized and mythologized and exaggerated before it happened, before white settlers entered. So there were boosters and promoters and people really far gone in fantasies about what the West would be and what it would mean, writing that stuff before there was much in the way of white settlement.
Right.
And then there were boosters and romanticizers and promoters and boosters primarily, I guess, while the settlement was moving on and entering all kinds of areas across the North America. So there's phase one of anticipatory mythologizing, and then there's in process, while it's all going on, mythologizing. And then with an overstated sense of conclusiveness, there's now the settlement is complete, and now we're romanticizing in retrospect. So that's 3 prolonged episodes of not paying much attention to what really happened.
Yeah.
And it's hard to recover from that. If one episode, maybe you could say, oh, well, the first boosters, they certainly exaggerated the promise and so on. But when you get these sequential layers of, I guess I will just say distortion, or just making things up that would be more satisfying than what was actually happening. So I was taking that on. And you could say that was some kind of psychodrama because my father had worked for Republic Films and had done a few Westerns and so on. But my father hated movies. He just hated them. So I guess I was probably following in his preferred footsteps there. But anyway, I was taking that on. Well, one thing that I did not know at the time I was doing that. So, okay, now we're back in the late 80s. I am going to bring this is my little dream, and I'm quite young, so I could think such a thing at this point. I'm going to bring reality to bear on this. At long last, here I am. I'm going to do that. I'm going to tell the actual story of the American West.
So what do you think the reality is? I mean, I know that's a ridiculous question because it's huge, but what is the reality? Go on. Sorry, go on.
Sure, but I will just say that
go on, yeah.
I did decide, I did that for several years. Relentless debunking. I shall help you all. I hold the key. I'll get you out of this myth labyrinth. You'll be out of that. Come with me. I'll do that. And then I realized that I wasn't persuading anyone. So that was a little bit, I was persuading on a very small scale. So I ended up kind of co-opting. I used to say the Western myth uses you before you can use it. And then I just thought, I might as well tap into this. So I started wearing Western wear. I started doing things that were very manipulative. I think it helped. I ended up with much better strategies for how to tell public audiences what they didn't want to hear. Just telling them they're wrong is not right. But saying, and this is getting back to your question, saying that the actual stories are 100 times more interesting.
I think that's always the thing with history, is that when you actually find out the truth, it's like, well, this is actually a fascinating story in its own right. What, all of the rubbish, and sometimes, The
people of the past are really uncooperative. When we can do it to them, we can oversimplify them, we can make them into stereotypes. We do that. They've got power, they're dead, they can't talk. But they will have left records that resist us. So every time we try to say, well, it was quite a simple story. There were some noble pioneers, and the noble pioneers went west, and there were some Indian people there, but they were only there temporarily. And now that was not going to work because it was not a very accurate story. But also the pioneers left much more complicated records. So you had to fight them if you wanted to simplify them. And that's where, so for instance, I have a friend there's two trends in current scholarship I want to tell you about, because I didn't do it. To a degree, I took the fire. I was the one who the older conventional thinkers could say, oh, it's that Limerick. She's really terrible. Someone should get her under control. But by focusing the antipathy on myself, I really cleared the path for lots of others. So now we have a whole track of people who are doing great work on, what is this thing called Manifest Destiny? It's a chapter in every textbook, every high school class, every college class. American History Survey has that's the only part you'll get on the West is a chapter on Manifest Destiny. The people of the past actually, did that mean something to them? Well, there's a wonderful scholar at University of Kansas, Andrew Eisenberg, and he has written a book that shows that, in fact, mostly the people who were engaged in Western settlement said that they wanted land. If they left a written record on what they wanted, it was that they wanted land. They did not use the phrase manifest destiny. They did not indicate that they thought they were engaged in the Lord's work and that God had destined their nation to. They hardly ever said that. Or in some ways, you can't prove what people didn't say.
Well, I suppose but what people tend to forget when they look back at history is that people are people, aren't they? If you met a bunch of people that went around saying things like that, even in the context of the time, you think these are pretty peculiar people. I mean, normal people don't go around saying, X, Y, and Z. I have a right to do this. I have a manifold destiny. But people just want to live. They wonder, where's the next meal coming from? Where's the next?
Right. So that's exactly it, and that's exactly it. That to get the simple-minded version of Western history, you really have to blind yourself and ignore the voices of the people of the past. You can do it, but you have to be ruthless and just saying, be quiet. We don't want to hear you. So a journalist in New York in the 1840s used the phrase manifest destiny, and something he wrote, a very politically driven piece he wrote. And a few people picked it up. And then hardly anybody actually engaged in the westward movement said, that's it. That's the phrase. And why would they? As you're saying, why would they do that? They wanted land, and they knew there would be places to get land. They could get land in Texas, which was still under Mexican control, and they would have to be Mexicans. Well, okay, we could do that. There was thoughts about a Pacific Coast Republic that might be independent of the United States. Well, okay, if we could get land, we could do that. So this notion that it was a great national destiny, my wonderful young colleague says, well, no, actually, that after the Civil War, it was hard to write. If you're a textbook writer, or you're writing any kind of overview narrative of American history, it's hard to write a coherent, cohesive narrative of a nation that fell apart.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? So my friend has a most excellent and convincing hypothesis that manifest destiny gave the textbook writers something to hold the nation together with. So years later, early 20th century, to write a coherent narrative, you unite American history with this notion that they always knew wherever they were from, Southerners, Northerners, they always knew they were headed on a destined movement into the West. But that's really reading that back in order to have coherence in a story, which I accept that. I also have some friends, Catherine Franklin, who's written a wonderful, not quite published book called The Army in Between. And that in that book, she found sources and the War Department records. Okay, so you could, if you wanted to research the history of the soldiers in the West, you could go to the official annual reports where you would have basically bureaucrats, officers reporting on what they had done over the course of the year. And those are rather formal and illuminating. Catherine Franklin found a whole other archive, started working with a whole other archive where officers are writing in distress. Oh, it's not going right. Something's wrong here. We have a problem. And that's obviously a far more illuminating source. And in those archives, she found plenty of officers, not the majority, I wouldn't guess say have a reason to say that, but a significant number of officers saying, what we're doing is intolerable. Indians are forced onto reservations. They are starved by corrupt figures, officials from the Office of Indian Affairs. They are starved because the money that is supposed to go to their rations is going to the profit of the officials. So the army, some officers said, is then forced. The Indians flee the reservation and the army is ordered to drive them back to starvation.
Yeah.
So officers were not, the famous book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, has this, here comes the army again. And they're just here for conquest and domination. And yes, true for quite a number of officers, but a whole other set of officers saying, okay, we follow orders. We have to follow orders. We're in the army. We'll do that. But this is really not what we're doing. Should take a lot more thought and deliberation and choice. And now we're going to the field and we'll do what we're supposed to do. So
I think as well, I mean, no doubt there are statistics and you may even know what they are, but I don't know, in terms of the people who moved west, many of them must have been recent immigrants to America.
Sure. Yeah.
For all I even know the majority, or certainly, recent immigrants who had moved to the east and then had moved west. So, they were really not part of, they might have been being manipulated, obviously, but right. They wouldn't have any great goal other than to find some land. Right. The sort of concept of the inevitability of the American continent becoming the American country via the West. Yeah. And looking back at it and saying, well, it was bound to happen. Well, as you've pointed out, why was it bound to happen? It could have been like Europe. It could have been half a dozen different countries. It could have been like Australia, where large parts are unoccupied. I mean, there's a variety of solutions that could have resulted. There was no manifest destiny, really. And you couldn't possibly have envisaged, looking at a map of the continental United States, think, right, in 100 years' time, this will all be one country and 50 states, blah, blah, blah. That's just inconceivable. But as you say, there's a definite, in my opinion, there's a definite view of that. I mean, based, again, my viewpoint is really much around Hollywood films, some better than others, obviously. But just go off a tangent very quickly. My father's living on his own. I was back with him a week or two ago. On the same afternoon, the BBC on a Saturday afternoon showed The Searchers and How the West Was Won. And I thought, if there isn't two propaganda films about, How the West Was Won is really about all these people, and this was always going to happen. And it didn't even have a fantastic time, and they beat off the baddies, but this family came from goodness knows where, and became, had land and a ranch and all this of it. And then The Searchers is, there's so many. I mean, we're not a movie podcast, but there's so many layers of that film of outright racism and all sorts of stuff. But here we are 150 years later, and in a country 3,000 miles away, on a Saturday afternoon, the major broadcaster, because it couldn't find anything out of broadcast, is showing some films about the American West. Right. It's reinforcing some of the myths. Right.
Which is why, if we look back, remember
Sorry, I think you've muted yourself, Patty.
No, you're okay.
Unless I've lost audio.
Well, that's odd.
Say something, John.
We can hear you, Ian, and we can definitely
carry on without me. Sorry, carry on without me.
It's okay, Patty. We can hear you.
Okay, and I might be. I think that I am still hooked into my other computer.
No, it's okay. It's fine. You're
already. So, but goodness, in fact, you spared me a lot of time and trouble by saying really sensible, necessary things. It took me a long time to realize when you were talking about, yes, many of them were immigrants, yes. And many of those people would be intoxicated with the promise of the nation they had come into. So they would be kind of immediate nationalists by saying, oh, the United States is giving me opportunities no one else did. So there can be that. There can also be I can't even understand the language these people are speaking, but I'm just going to get land and do my best here and so on. So I think we were bewitched into seeing a homogeneous group called settlers.
Yeah.
And they never liked each other. I mean, I shouldn't say that. they sometimes liked each other very much, and they sometimes helped each other and looked out for each other on the overland trail and so on. And they often fell apart and fought. And so this notion of a unified group of people that we can just call them settlers, and we can know what they're thinking, we can read their minds, we can read their souls. No, they're completely out of control. I mean, they just vary so much. Some settlers empathize with and feel for the native people and feel regret at how their own prosperity is. I would never even come near trying to estimate the percentages on that, but they exist. The people who say our prosperity is coming at a terrible cost.
I must admit, I was in the US once on a business trip, and we drove from Dallas. We were going to Austin, but we stopped in Waco because it looked like an inch on the map, and we thought, we could drive there and back in a day, and obviously you can't. And we got to Waco and thought this is too far. But we went to the Texas Rangers Museum that's there, and which was really interesting because it was showing you all of these Texas Rangers equipment, and their history, a bit of their history, and they got knuckle dusters and pistols and all this sort of stuff. And in other parts of the museum, there were the local native Indians, and there were photographs of them with these medals that were almost the size of a dinner plate, all this type of stuff. And I always remember they were saying that there was a Scots guy, I can't remember his name now, who was the founder of Waco, and they were saying these settlers turned up, and the native Indians who lived there decided to move 300 miles north. And I was thinking, what, just decided after being there for hundreds of years? It was just the way it said they decided to move.
Right.
And I was thinking, well, that can't be right. That cannot be right. And this is a museum. You think they might have a bit more accuracy in some of their...
There's such a desperate effort to claim innocence that doesn't really make any sense, because what can you do with innocence? Can you sell it, market it, clothe yourself in it? But it is such a... And meanwhile, I want to say there are just interesting little units of people, settler descendants, who look back at their ancestors and think, well, that's nothing I can support. And some of those people, the governor of Colorado in the territorial period, who was murderous and fear-mongering, he has descendants who have family reunions where they express their regret at having such an ancestor. And that doesn't mean they dissolve in white guilt and cannot be aroused from their tears and are just weeping over the tragedies of their ancestry. But there's plenty of things to do with your past besides say, well, they just decided to move. So it's just a very interesting chronic campaign to claim innocence that really doesn't give you much when you get it. It's a very, but anyway, but back to the things that Ian was saying. So the searchers, that's not really very much about the innocence of settlers.
No.
The family, yes, they are living there, and then they are burned out, and that's bad. And they asked for it because I'm sure they did not have a legitimate land claim, and so in a sense they asked for it. But the John Wayne character that's not innocence. So It took me a long time because of my father's conditioning of me. I thought, the movies, they are just nothing but distortions. But we have a great scholar here, a man named Harry Moshevitz, who lives in Boulder, and he actually watches the darn things closely and comments on it. and he's come to my classes and talked, and I think, well, this is an irritation, because now this friend has watched the movies and he is pointing out that is actually an astoundingly troubling image of westward expansion in John Wayne's murderousness.
Yes, it is. I mean, said we're not a movie podcast, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but some of these films have many layers, and it's interesting how the West has been subsumed under, is used as a vehicle for all sorts of things, isn't it? And it's interesting, Cold War stuff, racist stuff. And
that's what I think. Maybe this was liberating, or maybe it was just depressing. But I finally reached a point of just thinking, well, the movies don't have a darn thing to do with the West, except that it has landscapes that filmmakers are going to want to use, and horses look really good. Horses running. Yeah. And if you had put horses running around New England, it would be, I don't know, you're going to run into fences. So,
I ironically, with the searchers, because I've been to Monument Valley a couple of times, and if you've been there once, you think, why is he going round and round in circles all the time? But the scenery is the scenery. But not to do all the movies, but one thing I would like, without going into massive detail, because is it true to say there's many Wests? I mean, even to certainly say geographically, because there's the plains, that's the West, is it not? There's a mountain areas where you are, that's the West. There's Arizona, Nevada, that's the West.
Yeah.
California, I'll take your view on that. But there's various Wests, and to sort of say the West. When people say the West in the US, where do they really mean? I mean,
right. This is great. Thank you for that. And by the way, I do want to add that my friend Howie Moshevitz has pointed out to me that if this is a story of triumph and white men exerting dominance, the hero usually has to ride out of town. He can't fit in there.
Yeah, that's true.
It's just like, well, that's interesting. I mean, Gary Cooper and he has to get out.
Was John Wayne famously hated because it was un-American, didn't he? But
well, there you are. Okay, so but it is interesting to see that my friend Howie, by watching the movies, has really made me think. In some ways, well, they were offering us opportunities to think deeply about the West, but they were so engaging and stirring, and the music came up at the right time. The landscape with people that we were anesthetized and didn't think that damn movie just made us rethink everything we had assumed. We don't do that until we have our friend Howie who comes to class and says, "You did notice, didn't you, Shane? Little boy, come back, Shane." And Shane is going. So I don't know. I feel very good about what he has caused me to read. But maybe the main liberation was, I thought, they are using this setting because it is so striking for filmmaking, but they are imposing plots that really do not derive from Western history.
No. As
you just said, that they have some kind of drama they want the filmmakers and the public audience wants to have. I want to say that my great friend Liza Blatt wrote an excellent book on the incorporation of Indian people into movies in the 1950s, especially because the filmmakers, the studio heads thought, oh, this is a problem. White people are really interested in Indians, and so we have to get Indians in the movies and want that. And so there's this weird forms of recruiting. And then probably because of the Curtis photographs, where the process of Edward Curtis's photographs, the skin gets darker in the developing. So anyway.
Okay, interesting.
So the studio heads would go, oh, great, we got some Indians. That's good. We recruited them. They couldn't have speaking parts, so they would stay at the lower levels of the pay scale. Liza found all the records that show that. But they were dark enough, for heaven's sake, that American people want to see Indians. So they actually, Liza research is just extraordinary. She found the orders for brown paint. So there's such a strange thing, and that's the reason why I think just let us have opportunities to think about this. That good that American people wanted to recognize Indian people as part of the story. Good that the filmmakers felt under pressure to include Indians. Then look what happens when white people tried to use Indian people for their own purposes. And there's brown paint.
Yeah.
So it's so much more thought-provoking and tangled, which is why I feel like I have done fine once I shifted over from saying, I am going to tell this audience how wrong-headed they are, which didn't get, I'm not sure, I never said that, but that was my stance, to saying, I am here to tell you how interesting your place is, how interesting you are. And as inheritors of this, you are really worth, I am so glad you invited me to come here, because now I am here in Walla Walla, Washington, where I get to visit the Whitman Massacre site, and I get to think that through and hang out with the people who grow Walla Walla onions right next to them.
Right, but so just go back to my previous question. So Washington, as in Washington State, obviously, but that's in the Northwest. Is that the West?
Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to get back there, but
yeah.
Would you stop raising interesting questions? And I appreciate it, and I do get taken in with I'm charmed by each one. Okay, so I am now going to say, and I've never really thought this through before, but I think I'm going to, maybe I did before. Okay, so in the 1980s, late 1980s, early in the 1980s, I was the luckiest person in intellectual terms, because there was a thing called the West, and I could write about it, and I could define it. I never quite got to this definition, but this was clearly my definition. It is the part of the United States that no one pays attention to, or they pay goofy attention to. So I had that. This is great. Thank you. That's really interesting, because I really I didn't understand when people would say to me, well, just what do you mean by the West? And wasn't it once west of Jamestown, Virginia?
Oh, yeah.
That's not really what I meant. So, but this is great because I never really had a chance to say it had a coherent meaning, which was plains, Rockies, desert, Pacific coast, the neglected half or more of North America in the United States. So I could say, I wish you would all stop writing Eastern regional history and calling it U.S. history. Please pay attention to the West, which was code for the part of the sprawl of land that you were ignoring.
Right.
So I didn't know, I guess I was probably most troubled by the rainfall of the Pacific coast because it was like, arid West, aridity is, and semi-aridity, the defining qualities. Stop those redwoods from growing. Just don't do that. Don't have those very heavily wooded areas of Oregon and out. So that was interesting. I could feel discomfort and tension with that. I'm just trying to refer to the West, and now people are just having constant rainfall. So quit that. So I knew that I was having some conceptual problem in forcing everything together, and certainly the degree to which the Sun Belt was the more useful term in some ways for Arizona, Southern California.
But I wonder, again, and I don't want to get into a huge tangent on films again, is it because in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, making movies in the sunshine was technically easy? Making movies in the pouring rain of Oregon is not easy. So that, so that skew widths everywhere. Again, it's amazing the popular culture impact, isn't it?
Right. Well, exactly. That how long do you have to think about where you would prefer to be outdoors?
And just the technology of the time, the lenses, the cameras, the film stock, etc., etc. But anyway, that is a movie podcast.
That's right. Yeah. Can I just ask? Sorry, Patty. So when we talk about the West in this context, what time period are you talking about? Like from when to when?
Well, you have this conversation has altered what I might have said, because now I think there was a reason in the state of American attention in the academic world and elsewhere to talk about the West as this place that people aren't paying attention to or have silly thoughts about. Okay. I don't think we have that West now. In fact, we don't. And I'm really grateful that I got to write about that West because it made it so much more simpler. It was just so easy to say you were neglecting the West. Now, I am really so at peace with saying the key is you have to pay attention to the pieces and parts of this thing we're calling the West. Well, you don't have to, but you're going to do something very incomplete in American history if you don't do that. So I didn't say that. But I have taught a course a few years ago. I taught a course on imperialism and colonialism in the American West, parts of the Middle East and parts of Africa. And in fact, a boarding school in all of those places has basically the same curriculum. If you're subordinating indigenous people, there's some limits to the repertoire there. So I feel very liberated. I'm actually giving a talk at the Western History Association in October, and it's called Curtain Call. And it is about how I masqueraded as a Western regional historian. And I did that because I was right in thinking that the thing I was calling the West was neglected. But I also liked it because this gets right back to your question, Ian, I didn't have to make other tough choices. If people said, when I went for my interviews in 1979, universities, I could say, when they'd say, well, you're a Western American historian. I'd go, yeah, I am. And then sometimes they would be a little bit troubled by that. And they'd say, well, are you a political historian? Or are you environmental history was just coming into being, but are you an environmental historian? Or are you a historian of race and ethnicity? Or are you a historian of literature and intellectual history? And I just kept saying, yeah, all of those. Yeah, thank you. Oh, that's what I love about it. It's really good. So I'm not very good at specialization. And so by calling myself a Western regional historian, I escaped all the other corrals. I could be a historian of cinema if I wanted to be that. I could be that. You just name a part of an approach to history. Economic history? Sure, of course, better do that. So it was so fun just at my interviews in 1979 thinking, well, they never roped and tied me, if I could use a Western metaphor, and got me stuck in a particular time period with a particular thematic accent. I didn't have to do that.
So do you think there was a time, though, when to use that Hackney's expression, the West was won, it was done with the late 1890s, I don't know, and was there a time in the early colonial times when it started? Was there a time you could say this was the move to the west? This was the end of the
Oh, right. I don't really know how to define the ending, and I guess I wouldn't try to do that.
Yeah.
But okay, so I think it's a better framework to say, rather than westward expansion, and that's why I said that very explicitly in the book, we should say conquest, invasion, and conquest. Because that American history to international history and gives us reasons to do comparison, which is one of the most thought-provoking things you can do. So you're mentioning Australia, of course, we would want to say,
yeah, absolutely. Practically identical, really. Yeah.
Indigenous people and a bunch of people from elsewhere, some of them convicts in that case, but are coming. It's a little bit harder to claim innocence when you have arrived under those terms. But anyway, so that we can just be looking at this nation in this wider comparative perspective. So I would say expansion of empire, imperial, and it's deeply ironic because several people, not very many, are saying right now that we have a nation that comes to exist in rebellion against empire and almost instantly creates its own territorial expansion of empire.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, that's one reason for the rebellion, because the British, your people, were saying, don't keep moving. Proclamation of 1763, stop. You're stirring up so much trouble. Stop. You people did that. You're British people. Yay, British people. You tried. You didn't pull it off.
Which, funnily enough, John and I were discussing this just the other day, weren't we?
That's right, yeah.
And we came to the conclusion that was expedient on the behalf of the British, but how long that would have stayed in place is open to debate, isn't it? But
of course, but we do know that that was very motivating to George Washington.
And
others.
Absolutely.
And that's so ironic that now we are known because we are rebelling against empire, and that is what we have set the precedent for. And now we have an empire, and now we have the Interior Department, which is basically the home rule office of the people who control the empire. I just forgot the name of White. What is the place? White something or other that was the place of the British Empire's administration.
Whitehall.
Whitehall. Right.
Yeah.
So now we have that. Now we've got one of those. So interior is just so much. Okay, what did the British do to the colonies? Okay, let's do that to our colonies. Let's do that to our territories. And except that the British didn't really anticipate. Well, that's the great part about lessons, is that creating territories that evolve into states. That probably would have been a better idea.
Well, of course, and we're not here to bash any one country, because we've all got our A, our myths, and B, our less than glorious past rather. But what's going on with my mouth? The Louisiana Purchase. I didn't really realize this till quite recently. It took over parts of what is now the Midwest. It wasn't just Louisiana. It was 3/4 of what is now, or certainly half,
to Missouri, and it was quite a long north-south.
Yeah,
right.
And you could argue that was a great diplomatic coup, but I'm not quite sure what the Native Americans would have thought of it in that regard. But there's many examples of all sorts of countries where things like that happen. So we're not here bashing, and it's historical. So you can't. There's no point in bashing historical characters because they live in different times, up to a point. Yeah.
To notice common ground and common laws and common compromises and costs paid. So I don't think I was ever saying that's actually creeps me out in some ways when we have to consider the United States to be distinctively bad. Yes, it had a lot of power and it could get in a lot of people's ways around the planet. Yes, that's all true. But to say that the process of invasion and conquest here was somehow more horrible than South Africa or New Zealand, I just don't see why we would go into that particular form.
Better PR. That's the long and the short of it, isn't it? I had Hollywood behind it, or however you want to describe it. I mean, that's certainly because the John and I have discussed this in the context of Second World War, that Roosevelt was famously anti-colonial in terms of why should we support the British getting their empire back from the Japanese, which is a perfectly acceptable point of view. But then you got to remember, this entire country was taken from somebody else. Inverted commas discuss. There's lots of things around this, but it's interesting how the myth is built up of there was nobody here. They weren't using the land very well. We can farm. They weren't farming, etc., etc. It's interesting, and those are myths, I guess, without getting to politics, which still resonate today.
Yeah. I guess the people of the past, and this is again where they refuse our attempt to give them clear meaning, because I don't know that. I really have never seen anybody effectively make the case that beyond the rhetorical invocation of virgin land, unoccupied and open for claiming, a lot of the rhetoric of that. But anyone saying there was nobody there was just asking for extreme trouble.
Yeah.
By not
you could argue there's a sort of what if, in terms of, that when the European settlers first discovered North America and brought measles and other European diseases and essentially decimated the population of North America, if they'd have been resistant to those diseases, the actual volume, the population would have been significantly higher. It does make you wonder what the consequence of that would have been, because
Sure. Well, there's been some of these young scholars who are going areas I would never gone. That's really their point, is that it was not clear that the United States was going to prevail. This fellow, Andrew Eisenberg, writes about how at the same time of Indian removal from the Southeast, Congress funded doctors to go to the northern plains and inoculate Indians against smallpox.
Oh.
Why would they do that if they're removing Indians from the other area? Because they needed to make friends with the northern plains native people because they were still numerous and they were powerful. So it's not a clear reason not to do the manifest destiny thing is because it's not clear who's going to win.
And also, well, I wonder as well, this concept of the noble savage as well, and again, old-fashioned terminology, apologies if anybody's offended by that, but there's definitely a noble savage concept about Native Americans, isn't there? They're not enslaved by and large. The Aztecs enslaved,
right.
The natives and devastated the population as a result, and but that never happened in the United States, which is
happened a bit. Coerced labor, indentured servitude.
Well, okay, yeah.
California Indian people were very much subordinated in their labor.
Okay, all right, but they weren't owned like chattels in the sense of African Americans, were they? Or were they? I don't know.
Yeah, it's different, but it is still coerced labor.
Yeah. Okay.
So, which is but the point of that's both easily, I don't know what. Co-opted, but also just true that whatever murderous activities occurred, and there were many intentional murders and depopulations and so on, Indian people are still here and they're quite significant.
Yeah.
And they're very present and they have political influence and power and they have economies that in some cases are really thriving and so that is really a great thing that the story goes on. There's deep, brutal misery in the stories, but they're still here. Now, that does not trivialize the suffering. I don't say that in order to say, you see, it all kind of worked out. It did not in that. But there's still, I just feel like that's the missing dimension in white guilt, is to say, people can do that. Oh, it's terrible what happened to them. Oh, it's awful. Well, then the story goes on, play a part in the next part of the story.
Mm. Yeah, I remember when I was at Monument Valley with my wife 20 years ago, and we were driven around by a Native American guide. I want to say a Hopi, Hopi Indian. There was a lovely man, and he was telling us he kind of had a script, and he was telling us about all these movies were shot here and blah blah blah, and some of my uncles were in the films, and I think I can remember those films. Yeah. They were dreadful in relation to how they treated the memory of the Indians and the Native Americans. And I thought, how on earth? I wonder what this guy really felt like. Is it just this script for the tourists? Here's a couple of people from Britain, 5,000 miles away, and I'm telling him about a film where my uncle was patronised at best because that's what they want to hear. And what was going through his mind? I wonder if apart the fact we paid him for the privilege as well, but it was just fair enough. It's very complicated, isn't it? It
is, because let's just take the cowboy hat, which people often wear. Many Indian people wear cowboy hat, and in theory, they should abhor. In theory, in very abstract theory, they should think, "Oh, these are the invaders." But some tribes have done very well in raising cattle and become cowboys themselves. Indian rodeo is a thing. So the notion that there will be some purity of identity that will always rule. Some Indian people made complicated, difficult choices and allied themselves with the army. Yeah. The Crow people fought on Custer's side, the Little Bighorn, which was many Indian men became scouts for the army. Yeah. Indian scouts there's 2 wonderful books in preparation will be out soon about the native guys who chose that to say, well, let's try that. These poor fools don't know the terrain. The army does not know where they are and how to deal with the terrain. They need help. So why not manipulate that and use that in that? So the notion that there's this purity of Indian identity is just such a squishing of human complexity.
Well,
yeah.
Certainly 15, 20 years ago, there was a great, I say great, there was a movement that put the Native Americans in this box of being great environmentalists, wasn't there? They didn't ruin the countryside, but then you get the realities where they stampeded 400 bison off a cliff, and couldn't possibly have taken all of the resources off those 400 bison, and they took off 25. So they were just doing what humans do all the time. They were doing their best, weren't they? There was a definite, and I can remember in the 80s, there was certainly in the UK, and I'm not suggesting everybody was doing this for any stretch of the imagination, but there was a bit of a boom in Native American art. People, occasionally people would have a picture in their room, or they would have sort of, the blue glaze stuff or the blue clay work. Again, I'm not suggesting for any minute that everybody was doing this, but bearing in mind we're 5,000 miles from these people, they weren't doing that about the native Aborigines in Australia. Let's put it that way. All that did come a few years later with other aspects, but so it's amazing how these things are picked up.
Yeah, quite. And to expect anyone to play by some rules, there's a lot of intermarriage. There's a lot of people with mixed native. So I think there's just so many opportunities to skip overstated polarities and oppositions and either or things, and to say, well, there's a lot of things I guess we would just call hybrid. And if we really dig in there to just get something that is purely Indian and purely native, it's just like, first of all, people are dynamic and they're changing, and the way they live one way can't. So continue. But I guess what I would say now is that whatever was happening in the 1600s in North America, the people who were living here and had lived here for ages had figured some things out about where they were that people who just came out of nowhere and plunked themselves down didn't get. So now if you go to conferences on water, there's extremely good reason to have Native people speaking there about the sacredness of water. Because I can tell you as a Western American historian that I do not recall whatever they said about manifest destiny. They never said, the settler populations never said, God gave us these rivers and we must remember that God gave us these rivers and we should treat them with a sense of a creator giving us these rivers. We should create dams and reservoirs and diversions and so on. And some people actually did say God got started and then didn't complete the use of the water, that God put the water in the West, but didn't put it where it should be or needed to be. So there was this sort of, so the creator kind of got this. There's some people who say that, but in terms of the sacredness of water, which is key to life and has the best claim of any substance for sacredness, I think, it's really good. It's really important now that there are still people who knew that centuries ago. The descendants of those people are still available here to talk to us. So I'm not doing Indians as ecological saints. I'm not doing that. But I am saying there is something from having stories told to you that have been told for many years and hearing those stories as a child and then living in the world now and saying, here's some stuff that we've known. Yeah. So, which is so bordering. I'm showing all the twitching here because I'm so bordering on we'll just have to learn from the Indians and we took their land and now we're going to take their wisdom. Why don't we do that? So that's not what I'm wanting to say. But it's just great that that dialogue continues. Well, it wasn't a dialogue for much of the time, but except it was because white people didn't know where they were. And they had to keep asking Indian people how to get somewhere. So there's been a long tradition of saying, you'll have to help us figure out where we are.
There's something that you've triggered as a question for me on this. So if you look at, say, the parts of the West which weren't under the US before they took over, so Mexico being in the main part of where California is, how did they get on with the native population? Did they treat them any differently, or they just didn't put settlers in?
Oh, so sorry, say that again. What was the question again?
So so Mexico used to control large parts of California. So how did they get on with
Arizona, Nevada?
Yeah, and Arizona. So what was their relationship with the native population?
Would be, so complicated. different scenes in New Mexico, in California, and so on. But certainly in California, Spanish and Mexican people exploited Indian labor intensely. And that's where the whole pattern of Indian people is indentured, not enslaved, but indentured.
Okay. Yeah.
That was in place with the California Gold Rush. And that was adopted by enterprising white Americans and saying, we understand that California has been admitted to the Union as a free state, non-slavery state. However, as of the Spanish and Mexicans, we do have a little opportunity here. We can take their practices and keep this forced labor. So there's that. There's the really complicated story of New Mexico, where there is significant intermarriage. And to this moment, there are bitter conflicts between the Hispanos, the people who consider themselves to be direct Spanish descendants, and the Pueblo people, like native people. And some of that, on at least a couple of recent cases, has turned violent. So in some ways, much more incorporating in terms of the mandate to have missions converting Indian people to Catholicism, but that certainly is coercive and not tolerant. And then 1680 is the Great Pueblo Revolt, when the Spanish were tossed out of New Mexico. They came back in. The Reconquest was another over 15 years later, but it's not. I suppose if you wanted to say, well, here's a different example, the way the French were much more clever in their self-interest. The French in the fur trade were thinking, we're going to need these people on our side. And so we're more able to say, we'll tolerate some of your customs, or we'll adopt some of your customs. So the French might be the best of that. We're going to...
The Europeans.
Yeah, we're going to get what we want, and we're going to get most of it for ourselves. But we know that we have to keep you on our side. We know we need you as allies. So I don't know.
Well, then presumably there must have been Native Americans in what is now Quebec, and the French essentially colonized that in the context of the same way that the British did. So it's
right. Maybe not the same way. Maybe not.
Well, okay. No, absolutely. I mean, you'd know, I wouldn't. So yeah, absolutely.
For quite a while, they did not have. Probably just didn't have this significant number of Europeans wanting to settle.
No, indeed.
And for a long spell with the fur trade, especially, there are no French women or British women in the British parts of the fur trade to marry, so that there's a lot of actually quite intermarriage between
interesting
French and British traders.
So, I mean, my last thought is Pattie, this is multi-layered, multifaceted, fascinating on every layers. Why has it taken so long, and why is it still? I don't know if it is, but it sounds or why is it still a battle for historians to get attention?
It's really something. Okay, so there's the Western History Association is very well attended now. It was, and now that it's got a lot of young people, and they are asking questions I would never have thought to ask, and it's wonderful to see what's going on there. They are pretty academically oriented, a much greater range of ethnicity and identity and so on, but the professorial thing and the academic ambition thing is still quite dominant. So some of it is happening at the sessions at the Western History Association are really wonderfully complexifying and unsettling, but they're audiences of professors listening to some other professors or graduate students. So there's still a major problem. This is true for any field of history, really, of connectivity between the researchers, academic researchers, and a wider audience. So that's part of it. The second part is that not everyone, it's a really big thing, not everyone has what I have. This friend, Howie Moshevitz, who watches movies and tells me what they're actually doing in there. So
do I get the impression you don't go to the movies then, Pattie?
I don't go to the movies. I don't go to the movies much, but I will. If Howie, I've done the searchers classes on the searchers several times with Howie. So I don't go to the movies, partly because I am overpowered by them. I am so much a sucker to whatever they want me to feel or do.
To be fair, there aren't any.
You wouldn't stand up and start shouting at the screen saying that's wrong. What the hell? This is rubbish.
That's always the problem, isn't it? Watching something that you intrinsically see as wrong, it then ruins the movie, doesn't it? You think, well, what's the point of watching it?
It's just like I used to say, but it's so odd because there are all kinds of movies about Martians, but nobody who sees those movies leaves going, now I know a lot about Martians. So it's weird that the same thing Or I would never say, oh, there should not be movies about Martians because that distorts we don't know enough about Mars to characterize it in a movie. I'm just going to do what you want with the Martians, but because nobody's going to say, now I've got it here. Now I understand. So that's what's so curious about it is you can watch the Western movies, the classic ones, in a very superficial, unsearching, unthoughtful way. And you can leave thinking, now I've learned a lot. And now I'm really quite acquainted with the history of the West. So that's persistent. And I don't quite know, except that I guess I'm going to say that everybody needs something that is not going to pass the test of accuracy and realism, not just realism, reality. And maybe, I'm going to say this, I don't know if I mean it, but maybe this is a better version of that than hundreds of other versions of now I'm going to believe that there's a campaign to replace white people with dark-skinned others. I mean, I don't think that's what comes from a Western movie. I don't think you could get that. So I think maybe it's a sort of place where people could go have wrong-headed ideas. And
well, it's hard to imagine that a Western being made now which involves Native Americans. Obviously, many Westerns don't make reference to any Native Americans. They're just vehicles for drama. But it's hard to imagine a movie being made now about involve Native Americans with the same level of racism and stuff that some of the 1950s want. It just wouldn't be acceptable.
Right.
So in that sense, it's improved 1,000-fold, hasn't it?
Right. And it exactly. And if you're paying any attention, not necessarily watching the reissuing of another Little House on the Prairie series.
Oh yes, so that's popped up and I saw that. Yeah.
They're really in there now, and the OC are whole people and not easily dismissed and actually treated in a different way by the settler family than they were in or Ingalls Wilder's writing. So it's much better. Much better, except that the President of the United States issues executive orders for truth and sanity in American history, and that is something that is so out of connection to everything that historians have been doing with the American West for ages. And yet, now I'm going to blame the victim a little bit here because we just didn't think through. Western historians did not think through how to communicate persuasively to a wider public. A few did, plenty did, a whole bunch did, but otherwise, it was just there were too many vulnerable flanks in the academic style of communication. And it was not unreasonable, but not effective to accent the grim and negative parts of westward expansion without noticing that a lot of people who were going to get nowhere in Europe as landowners ended up getting a new start. So there's something about saying, not getting stuck with for too long, we said positive things about westward expansion, and now we'll have to make up for that by saying only negative things about westward expansion. Has to be some phase of, in fact, legacy of conquest is a little bit funny. The last line of one of the chapters on particularly Western farming settlement and so on, it says, I wrote something like, it is important to remember that the people involved in westward expansion, the great majority of them had no intention of doing injury to other people. They were seeking opportunities. They were trying to find better circumstances for their families. So that was me in 1986 when I wrote that, just saying, could we recognize that, of course, their actions led to very unfortunate outcomes for Native people? Was that their primary motive? No. Were they insufficiently attentive to the impact of their actions? Yes. But they did not think, let's despoil the continent and the natives. Let's do that.
No, it's interesting. I mean, I read a book about a similar issue in Australia where a Scotsman who had been forced off his land in the Western Isles of Scotland by the landowner to replace him with sheep went to Australia and did exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So, and I would classify him as not being evil or any. It's just, I think it's to a large degree it's human nature. I'm not suggesting everybody would do that, but it's in the nature of certain humans and maybe even a majority. It's just giving an opportunity to do so.
Right. Right. And I would say academics are an interesting group because we were not always celebrated as welcome new comrades in the profession, and we had to learn how to do things the way our elders had learned to do it and so on. And then many of the people who went through that then did that to the next generation.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to be to say,
which is why we have laws and rules, because the only thing stopping people doing that are laws and rules. But it takes, it takes generations to get laws and rules into wilderness. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that there's a really crucial question about how much denial of the complexity of human nature has gone into everyone's position on history.
Yeah.
But there's some dream of people being better than they are.
Yes.
But
Well,
seductive.
Yeah.
But
On that philosophical point, sure, we could talk all day.
And this is unbelievably fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, we've only scratched the surface.
Well, indeed, what I'd like to suggest, Patty, is that that's a great starter for 10, as we say in the UK occasionally. We'd like to come back and look at some specific areas at some future point.
You bet. Count me in.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
That's been, I'm not here to just blow your trumpet for one of a better expression, but that has been fascinating. Really is.
Yeah. It's a real eye opener. I mean,
thank
you, and it is scratching the surface. So
absolutely, more than aware of that. And I've just been scrolling. Out of curiosity, I've just been scrolling through your books. If I were to pick, I've got to admit I haven't read one yet, but if I were to pick one now, which one would you recommend?
Definitely Legacy of Conquest.
Legacy of Conquest it is. Well, I've read that before we speak to you again.
Well, already, and it's almost, it's 1987, so it's really coming up on a round number anniversary, but it still seems to, it's fun to look at it. I haven't done that in a while, and see what is clearly outmoded, but a lot of it is not. So,
we say outmoded in terms of your thoughts have moved on, or is that what you mean? Or
it's just language that use terms that use now.
Well, we're of your age, Patty, so I think that we'll be all right. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
right. So on that bombshell, then, thank you, Patty. That has been a fantastic episode for us. It's definitely explore some more. We will be reading your books, and hopefully we'll have you back on as a guest again. So thank you very much for joining us today.
All righty. Thank you. Bye.
Bye for now.
Right. Well, that's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends. Today's episode was sponsored by O Techno, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Uncle Schnookums Incorporated, the advanced technology divisions of Gyrocash, the crypto fumiers. Because our currency is never clean.